Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Algiers, Shook. Here's a strident opinion that might be a bit contentious. If Algiers is not part of your conversation of where alternative, gothic, post-punk, or noise music is within the past decade, I think you're missing a big part of that conversation. Now, that is a pretty loaded statement, but how often do you get an act with such a fully formed, genuinely unique, and incendiary sound erupt from the crux point of a half dozen different genres with thoroughly challenging and cerebral music, all the while kicking tremendous ass? I can argue that Algiers' first two records are among the absolute best of the 2010s, and it's not particularly close. And now they fuse together soul, gospel, and blues with post-punk, goth rock, and noise, even rap, with songwriting that has remained frighteningly relevant over the years. Hell, I would go a step further and say that's only become more prescient as cultural attitudes and aesthetics have slid closer to their paradigm, not the other way around. There's nothing quite like Algiers, even now, and that's high praise indeed for a band that does not make things remotely easy for their audiences. And I include myself in that conversation, because 2020's There Is No Year was an album that I really struggled with. A chilly, rigid, pulsating exercise and crushingly introspective deconstruction that didn't quite have the sinuous, explosive firepower of their first two. It wasn't really an album that stuck in my rotation as long as I would personally like, one I respected more for its fearsome intellect and challenging themes than I outright loved it, and given the year that would follow in 2020, its existential nightmare almost became oppressively difficult to revisit. Even though a couple years later, I can say it's aged rather quite well. And that's one reason I was really excited for Shook. Stacked up with the guest appearances that span from Zack Rocha of Rage Against the Machine to Billy Woods and Backxwash, from Boy Harsher to all manner of acts in black experimental music, from electronica to spoken word, it seemed to promise Algiers' most expansive record to date. And at 55 minutes, I was gearing up for a pretty daunting listen. Even a lot of the critical acclaim suggested that this was music critic on hard mode material. But let's be real, that's kind of been true with Algiers since the very beginning. And given that the band brought a lot of the production back in-house, I was really excited to get into this. So what did we get? Okay. Here's the odd thing with Shook. I think if you're coming into this project expecting something similar to any of Algiers' last three albums, you will struggle with this. Not in terms of the content per se, in terms of the imagery and fiercely intelligent writing, Algiers is once again operating at a very high level, although thematically there are some welcome evolutions that reminded me of the most striking moments on the underside of Power, but structurally this album feels very different to the more composed, self-contained collections of songs on their first three projects. It's one reason that you've seen some critics kind of bounce off of this, even if they appreciate a lot of the ambition and the execution. It is harder to pull out individual tracks rather than treat this as a larger, self-contained construct, which to me places this much closer to the experimental rap albums of the past couple of years, especially out of, say, Backwoods Studios. Now, that was not an issue for me. I've had the opportunity to get pretty deep into this style and sound and territory over the past couple of years, and it does lead to a different Algiers experience. I'm not always sure it flatters their greatest strengths, but I can respect the hell out of what they delivered all the same, because this is pretty damn great. Maybe even among the best of 2023. But let's start off with that structural shift, because it does impact how you take in an album like this. I've seen folks describe this as a very stop and start, a patchwork in between cavernous post-punk and noise and blues, a lot of experimentation, and a considerable amount of Atlanta hip-hop and trap, complete with spoken word passages most recognizable from Big Rube of Dungeon Family, amongst others. And I think patchwork might be the wrong word here, because when you shift to processing this project closer to a hip-hop album, the flow of samples, grooves, genre shifts, and breakdowns, they feel more intertwined than you might initially think. Algiers cited DJ Premier and DJ Screw as inspirations to this, and you can absolutely tell, from how Primo would let samples and juxtapositions create its montage and message, and how DJ Screw would twist and disrupt that established flow to drive into this murky mindfuck, and on songs like like something wrong, it decomposes that killer midnight groove into a horrifying police encounter with echoing siren synths that could feel all too familiar before it erupts into a Soul Glow-esque slice of jazzy hardcore punk. It doesn't allow for much momentum to build in comparison with how the self-titled album or The Underside of Power would just crush everything underfoot, but I do think it is well sequenced in terms of tones and themes, a quilt of interlocking ideas and textures that will move at a slower pace but knit together effectively, even if there can be slight traces of redundancy by stacking the same conceptual ideas so close together. That being said, if you're here for those cacophonous, crushing bangers that let Franklin James Fisher just rip loose and holler, I think there is less of that. He leans more onto his rapping and spoken word proclamations, and while he is a remarkably tight MC, almost reminding me a bit of Killer Mike in some of his inflection at points, sometimes you do find yourself missing some of that level of intensity. Algiers is so unique in this space that you kind of miss some of that explosion, especially on longer songs like Green Iris, where the more meditative, healing mantras can really take their time as the songs will then warp and contort beneath your feet, where even there it picks up this looser, swaggering martial stomp by the end, but that could have been a song in and of its own right. Granted, some of that swerve feels intentional as well, and that leads us to the content. Algiers seems to know their target audience and those who are listening, and while the heavy lean on apocalyptic imagery is to be expected, and that's going to throw your average listener, there is another layer of complexity that doesn't just want to focus on black pain and suffering, of which they recognize how some allies in the fight will only perceive them, made explicit on Comment 2, another spoken word piece. So while they're all still very brutally realistic surrounding the ongoing struggle, right from the opening track, Everybody Shatter, Algiers want to showcase how tangibly shook one can be from the stresses of surviving amidst systemic racism and late capitalism. They also want to showcase the messy complexities and the communal reality of actually building something for the other side, which does not make for a lot of straightforward anthemic bangers. Hell, I Can't Stand It seems to be written from the perspective of someone who sees their relationship break down because their partner may have joined the movement, and the pain and regret is palpable, especially as you can wind up unintentionally hurting each other in the process, which is then echoed on the next spoken word piece, All You See Is, showcasing the real need for repair and forgiveness. And you know, all this makes sense. Challenging systems of oppression is messy and complicated, requires that you confront your allies and those in your own community how have benefited on that system, like on 73%. But it necessarily makes a difficult album, especially when there's as much introspection building off the deconstructive side of There Is No Year to confront their own culpability. And the aesthetic and flow of the album mirrors that. There are points where it swerves almost from deliberate satisfaction, and necessarily the cathartic rush of emotions does not manifest as strongly on the surface, especially with the momentum feeling so stymied. Hell, early on with Cleanse Your Guilt Here, it's explicitly self-critical, where it acknowledges that so many people just want that shot of commodified rage, and then even that song will vanish before any sort of climax materializes. Now, that is not saying that Shook doesn't have a lot of impact if you're prepared for some of that open discomfort. In fact, if you are familiar with the reading going in, spanning symbology, leftist text, postmodern philosophy, and a healthy dose of biblical apocrypha, thematically this album actually coalesces pretty effectively and will still kick plenty of ass. Irreversible Damage with Zack de la Rocha, prime example, where it takes on that apocalyptic framing to realize that for as much damage has already been done within these Kafkaesque systems, you can still fight. And the guitar is spiking off the brittle percussion, the jagged guitar passages do a lot to create that needling sense of panic. Bite Back with Billy Woods and Backxwash, and I mean, that feels like the sort of collab that's designed to make experimental rap nerds just overjoyed, especially with that stalking groove and the beat switch up to something that's a lot more percussive and crushing underfoot when Backxwash really comes in. But it's also a song that seems to target a lot of white liberals and leftists that would placate the black military presence rather than join the fight, utilizing a frankly inspired symbol of the White Crow, paradoxically a rare symbol of life and hope, But really, is it just a recoloring of death? Especially when folks are still surrounded by many of those symbols and systems of their oppression, that tearing those down would cause such a fuss. Why not just wait? But sometimes you have to bite back against that poison. It gets even more explicit in the jazzy spoken word sound collage and critique of how those protest moments get appropriated or crushed underfoot on out-of-style tragedy. Then there's A Good Man, the sort of aggro punk banger with phenomenal shredding, and some of Matt Tong's best drum work with Algiers, although I do wish his bass kick and snares cut through with a little bit more punch. And while I'm here, there are parts of this album where I wish that his drums were as loud and crisp as some of the program beats, but the challenge here is to men who want to join the protest to make themselves feel good or assuage guilt, especially for white guys who still benefit from those systems. But Algiers acknowledges that there is room in the movement, as the icy clanking synths of Cold World showed that when you're finally ready to get the hell out of your own head, accept the harsh global reality, look outside yourself, Algiers are waiting on the other side. The movement is ready to carve forth that brand new world. And even then, Momentary, the closing track, highlights what Algiers have captured here. It is just a moment. It feels like a callback to their debut and showcasing the artifice of the constructed look behind the curtains. Amidst Lee Bains III's spoken word describing what that new world could be, all we have are moments in this life. It's up to you to actually, do something with them. So yeah, the album absolutely works. It resonates as a fully composed whole, but that's a tricky thing. If you're looking to go for individual standouts for singular songs, despite some of them having the length or gravitas to stand as centerpieces to have earned all the attention, they all kind of work stronger in the album's context, as interlocking motifs and ideas will echo and flow into each other, a feverish experience that doesn't exactly make for a lot of easy sloganeering, and that's the point. But it also gets difficult if I want to go back to an individual song and feel like I gotta re-listen to the whole album to get the fullest experience, especially as this is not an easy album to take in and process, especially when Algiers can make individual moments so goddamn potent so you want to. Granted, this is absolutely an album that gets better with every listen. After nearly a dozen, I'm inclined to say this may wind up among the best of 2023, but I also think this is not one that's gonna work for everyone, and the layers of structural, experimental, and thematic difficulty will simply be too much for a lot of listeners compared to the underside of Power. So I will highly recommend Shook, especially for more of a hip-hop audience. I wish more rap listeners would give this a proper shot. I think it would really work for them, but like a lot of conceptual, complex, experimental music, it might not hit the first time, or even at all. It's got some of the strongest moments in their catalog, but absolutely their most challenging. I still think everyone should hear it though. Sometimes you do need to get shaken awake. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I know this review is late. Sometimes you need a dozen listens to fully process an album that might not click the first time, but actually works all the better like a dozen listens in. And when you have an album that's nearly an hour long, that can be tough to get to. Please actually share this around and go check out the album too. This album's not getting the traction that I really think it deserves, because again, I think even some critics are a little alienated with it. They're bouncing off. But beyond that though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Please leave your comments on your interpretations, because again, I think this album is complicated, and I'd love to get this review shared around, because again, this sort of album's not getting the traction it deserves. But if you want to get projects on my schedule, or support the channel beyond my merch links down there below, the link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but the option's available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.